Respected Flavia ma'am, members of the faculty, and members of the JB, a very good evening and a warm welcome to the 115th IDG session. It is indeed an honor for IDG to host Miss Flavia Agnes, a renowned women's rights lawyer and co-founder of Majlis organization today. Ma'am, on behalf of entire IDG family, I thank you for taking out time from your personal and professional engagements and gracing us with your presence. We are overwhelmed to be hosting a person of your repute and stature. With increasing cases of domestic violence against women across the globe, it is critical for women to have the right knowledge, courage, and support throughout their journey for justice. Knowing painfully firsthand how domestic violence can shatter one's world, MAM offers hope and sharp eyed legal advice to victims. The topic for today's session is domestic violence in COVID-19 pandemic, a critical analysis of the gender blind legal system. I request Nadia Murshid to give a brief introduction of the guest for all the attendees.
A very good evening to all. I, Nadia Murshid, member of IDG, would take the privilege of welcoming you all to the 115th informal discussion group session. We have amongst us Ms. Flavia Agnes, who is an eminent women's rights lawyer, author, and a well-known public figure. Ma'am expertises in marital, divorce, and property law. She has written and published numerous articles, some of which have appeared in journals like Subaltern Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, Manushi. She writes on themes of minority and the law, gender and law, law in context of women's movement, and on issues of domestic violence, feminist jurisprudence, and minority rights. Ms. Agnes began working in the field of law of women in law in 1980s, which was at the beginning of the second phase of women's movement. And since 1988, Ma'am has been a practicing lawyer at the Mumbai High Court. Her own experience with domestic violence inspired her to become a women's rights lawyer. She also advises the government on law implementation and currently advises the Ministry of Women and Child Development in Maharashtra. Along with Madhusri Datta, Ms. Agnes is the co-founder of Majlis, which is a legal and cultural resource center that campaigns for and provides legal representation for women on issues of matrimonial rights, child custody, etc. Ms. Agnes became a guest faculty at NLSIU Bangalore after completing her MPhil from NLS Bangalore. She is also a member of the visiting faculty at Naltar and General Global Law School. She continues to be called to universities in India and abroad for guest lectures and panel discussions covering issues of legal importance. She has also taught in medical schools. We are honored to have Ma'am with us today in this session. Ma'am will be answering questions on the topic increase in incidence of domestic violence in COVID-19 pandemic, a critical analysis of the gender-blind legal system. The moderator of today's session is Aditi Singh Chandel. Now I would request Aditi to take over the mic.
Thank you, Nadia. In order to make most of this session, I sincerely request the audience to keep their microphones in mute and post questions to ma'am through the chat box. Now, without keeping the attendees from waiting any further, I graciously invite ma'am to address the attendees.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And actually, you had given me a list of topics, and I have combined two. One is domestic violence during the pandemic, COVID-19. And another one was laws and policies which adversely affect women. And I wrote to you that I would like to combine these two. Actually, what exactly happened during COVID-19 and what are the laws or policies or precautions that were taken to curtail the spread of the pandemic and how it adversely affected victims of domestic violence. So let me start here, firstly with our constitution. In the constitution, we have Article 14, as all of you know, which says that men and women are equal. You cannot discriminate against women. Now, when you bring in a policy, it does not discriminate. Men and women are affected in the same way. But this is a further principle. As law students, you will know that equality can only be between equals. If unequals are treated with the norm of equality, then the inequality between them increases. It does not bring in equality. In fact, it raises the bar of inequality. To remedy this, our constitution has Article 15(3). To set right the historical wrongs, we have to do something more for the marginalized section so that they become equal, and then the equality bar can be applied to them. These are two important things I want to flag today. One is Article 14, equality. What happens when you apply the bar of equality to men and women who are not equal? And why is there Article 15(3)? And what is its relevance when you deal with situations of women, particularly vulnerable, marginalized women, and how they cannot be treated equally? So here I want to say, when the pandemic started, since there were no vaccines, etc., the first measure that the government brought in was lockdown to curtail the spread of the disease. And according to our government, we fared very well because we brought in very strict measures of lockdown and restricted social contacts, contained people in their homes, restrictions on travel, train stopped, bus stopped, travel stopped, everything stopped. Court stopped, police station, everything stopped. Two things happened here. The law enforcement agency, the police, were concerned about enforcing the lockdown. And that became their major duty, ensuring that people stay at home. And everything else became unimportant. Our primary concern was only to stop the spread of the disease because it was a life and death situation. The flip side of the lockdown, we all know what all happened because the lockdown came in. They came in suddenly. The country was not prepared for it. Nobody knew what would happen. There was uncertainty, there was fear, there was a panic everywhere. And of course, the government had a knee-jerk response to it. That overnight, within a matter of 4 hours, we are closed down everything. We are going to bring down lockdown. So we know what happened to the migrant labor, the impact of social distancing on mental health, the economic impact on vulnerable sections of the lockdown, how our economy came down. Now, these are all discussed very extensively because very soon, within a month, within 2 months, people went to court. They said this migrant labor is dying on their walking thousands of kilometers to their hometowns. And people died of sheer exertion. People died of accidents. People were mowed down by trains. All this became national news. So while the lockdown had certain positive effects, it had far more negative impact. And the country suffered enormously in terms of an economic meltdown, collapse of the economy, in fact. And there were actually the adverse impact of being locked down in a home, the psychological impact People were depressed. People were without social contact. They were into a terrible mental status, and people near them were dying. There were so many deaths in families. Sometimes families got wiped out. All this. What was not envisaged is domestic violence will increase. It was not envisaged. Country after country, it was not only in India, everywhere. Third world, first world, US, UK, Australia, Canada, every single country registered an increase in the number of desperate cries of women to helplines, to service providers, to state agencies, etc. And India was no exception. In fact, the UN Women in a paper called it a shadow pandemic. There was a pandemic, alongside there was a shadow pandemic. Now here, when we see shadow pandemic, what happened? When you say you stay at home, and home is safe for you, going out is dangerous for you, you realize if you're in an abusive relationship, staying at home is not safe for you. Reducing social contact is not safe for you. Because you are locked in the house with your abuser. And not just that, he's an abuser, but he is also a frustrated man. He may have lost his job. There's no money coming in. He's not getting his alcohol. If the wife is a domestic worker, she's not able to go and bring in money. Now, all these things added to the frustration of abuser husbands. And the only way they could vent it out was on their wives. Women had nowhere to go at all. And those who were relatively from a higher strata, relatively I'm saying, could make calls to the helpline, to the National Commission for Women, to the police helplines, etc. But there were many who did not even have access to a telephone or mobile phone. They were with the abusers, so they could not make even a call because many times, at least in the city of Bombay, it would be just one room, and the husband would have the mobile. So how would this woman make a call to a helpline number? Okay, but if you are able to make a call to the helpline number, what will the helpline do? What will the helpline do for you? They will record. So and so woman called. Then what? She's in the same situation. She needs to get out of this situation. None of it is provided. So when I say law or policy impacts unequals in a very different way and pushes them down, this is a very clear example of that happening. Now, in Mumbai, where we offer legal services to women, what happened was transport was closed down. Women were making desperate pleas to their lawyers, to the organizations, saying that I'm in this abusive relationship, my life is in danger, my husband has been extremely abusive. Next best thing they knew was to go and file a police complaint. So they walked all the way to the police station. There are no buses, there are no rickshaws, no nothing. So they walked. They walked 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, whatever the distance, in that situation of extreme distress. So what happened when they reached the police station? All the police stations had barricades. They were not letting anyone come inside. What they would tell them is, send your complaint online. Send us an email. So many people did not have that access to send an email. Many women did not know how to send an email. There was nobody to help them. But even if they managed to do that, the police would not respond to emails at all. Nothing at all. Then, under the Domestic Violence Act, to help women, there is an agency called protection officers. Then this protection officer is supposed to help this woman to reach a hospital or to reach a shelter, to reach somewhere. But the protection officers were not working. While healthcare workers were declared as emergency services, protection officers were not declared as emergency services at all. So that actually closed down. So where will this woman go? And the worst is that if she manages to reach the police station or call the officer or call somebody, and she says, my life is in danger, I need to reach a shelter home. Firstly, there's no transport. The police refused to provide her the transport to reach the police station. When she reached the police station, the shelter home would not accept them because of the pandemic. Then she would be sent somewhere for a quarantine for 15 days. Only after that, the shelter home would open up. And the worst is courts shut down. So police stations shut down, protection officers shut down, helplines were not effective. They were just recording like a database they were creating and nothing more than that. Shelter homes she couldn't reach, they were not offering shelter. But the worst is the courts were not functioning. You could not go to court and get an emergency order. You could not file a case in the court. I mean, such dire emergencies. If the police station, if the court, if the hospital, all of them don't care, where will you go? So one level, you are locked in with an abuser. And other level, the support mechanisms had collapsed totally. Now here, when you say support mechanisms had collapsed totally, a lot of women were in the courts. Their maintenance orders had been passed, or urgent injunctions were pending. And the husband knew very well the courts were not working. You could not go to a court. You could not implement a court order. If the order is violated, there was nothing you could do. Husbands were supposed to pay maintenance, stopped paying maintenance. One level they had lost a job, but other level, even when they had the money, they knew that this woman cannot do anything. What can the woman do? So in such situation like this, every single support mechanism just collapsed. How did other countries deal with it? Other countries seem to have done slightly better than us. Like I read somewhere, I think Australia, Canada, some countries, they put in notices in grocery stores to say some numbers they gave, some places they said you can reach out to. And they also put out certain code words that use these code words when you're communicating so that the abuser is not aware. I do not know more of the details about how it worked, but at least they devised something new to respond to the situation that is there. Then there were people who are services, health workers, because the health workers were declared emergency service providers. So healthcare people had access to people's homes, but they did not have any awareness about domestic violence. They did not know the mechanisms that a battered woman could use. So they could not provide any support or any kind of mechanism. So in many countries, they made health workers aware that when you go to a house, when you find somebody in need of services, advise them like this, give them this kind of support, and give them these, share with them these numbers, share with them then what they can do next. I mean, if you're sick, you would be taken to the hospital. But you were abused in the same home. Nothing would be done to you. Because healthcare people, healthcare providers were not declared emergency service for women. Battered women. And that, according to me, is a major failure. Many countries immediately stepped in And they provided this training for the health workers that when you go to a home, you must do this. Find out if that woman is safe in that home. We didn't have those kind of measures at all. Nobody cared. And thirdly, the state response. That state put its hands up. They didn't do anything. They were so busy dealing with the pandemic. Though these cases were coming out, UN was giving a warning signal, National Commission for Women was giving a warning signal, everybody was giving a warning signal saying domestic violence cases are increasing, But our state, different health ministry, women and child ministry, home ministry, any of these ministries did not take it upon themselves to see what went wrong in our policy. Where did we go wrong? What we didn't do right? Why is these cases of women, domestic violence against women increasing? There was absolutely no, that kind of alert was missing. And it seemed like nobody's business. It's even in the first round of lockdown and the second round of lockdown, we did not bother to do anything at all. Then the third question here is, people did not have food to eat. Children were not going to school. Online classes, only very higher classes could afford. Those who attend municipal school and private schools, all of them could not. There would be one phone in the house. And what online classes, and what do you mean by all this? The education of poor suffered very, very drastically. But another issue that I want to flag from our own experience, that apart from domestic violence, we also provide support to victims of sexual abuse, and particularly children. While cases of rape in the public domain went down because people were not going out, they were not on the streets, etc., sexual abuse within the home increased. Father, mother, children are all in the home. Wife is a battered woman. Children became easy victims in that same household. But the family members could abuse them, the father could abuse them. And this, according to me, is the most horrible thing that happened during the pandemic. It's not flagged sufficiently. We're talking about domestic violence, but we're not talking about sexual abuse by family members of children sufficiently. We're only like, in passing, we have mentioned this. We do not have the data. We do not know how many such cases are there, but there are cases filed by the police, and if you can definitely see an increase in this. So the point that I want to make by giving you this is that when you get in policy, when you're dealing with the pandemic, and you're bringing in drastic measures, you are forgetting that there are women who with special needs. There are special issues concerning women. Women are vulnerable. And when you bring in this policy, simultaneously you have to bring a parallel policy so that women can be helped out. Some countries learned very fast and they brought in remedial measures. But India lagged far behind. And as it is in India, the statistics already showed that 1 in 3 women suffers from domestic violence. It was already there in a whole South Asia region. So you can imagine what happened during the pandemic. Now we have not really recovered from that. Courts have just started opening up. At least in Bombay, courts are still not passing orders. And maintenance has not been given. Some relief was given by NGOs, etc., a little bit relief by the government. But overall, a lot of people stopped. A lot of people did not have 2 square meals a day to eat. So it's not only violence increased, support structures decreased, but even basic food was not there. So in order to, now this has happened, this is not the first time. Whenever there is a pandemic, when there is a crisis, domestic violence always increases. Like for instance, during the AIDS pandemic, there were a lot more domestic violence cases. During the tsunami, there were a lot more domestic violence cases. In the US, during the Katrina cyclone, a lot more domestic violence was seen. So during earthquakes, during landslides, during floods, in every other situation, you will see that domestic violence increase. So it's not that government did not know. It is not that the health departments were not aware. It's not that women and child department did not realize this. They all knew. But in their panic to control and curtail COVID-19, they just did not bother. It didn't strike them at all. As if, I mean, they function as if women don't matter. So that is why I'm saying Article 15.3 is very important to bring in the equality of Article 14. Without that, the Article 14 does not mean anything at all to the vulnerable class. There is poverty, there is violence, there's insecurity, and women suffers the most in such a situation. So all I want to say here is the end here saying that in future, this is a lesson for us for the future. And we must take this lesson very seriously and see that whenever we have this kind of policy measures, say from the health department or crisis management, emergency crisis management, disaster management, whichever department, it is very important they also coordinate with women and child welfare department. And they together bring in policies, evolve programs and relief measures which will take care of this vulnerable section. This is the lesson for the future. So what preparedness is there among our basic healthcare providers, which is there this ASHA and Usha, all these healthcare providers, basic healthcare, primary healthcare providers need to be equipped with the knowledge of what to do in a case of domestic violence, because they are the only one visiting the homes. For instance, BMC, health department, for us in Bombay, the BMC, or whatever municipalities, they have a very vibrant unit. During the pandemic, they were very, very active, and they were ensuring that cases are detected, they taken to the hospital, etc. If they were made aware that when you go there, you can also do this, find out the situation of the women in the house, and give them the numbers to alert them. This is how care has to be provided. This is where access to shelter has to be provided. Ask the woman what she needs, how she will cope with this. Does she need a shelter immediately? Does she need to approach a police station immediately? Then term this measure as an emergency measure. You cannot not just do a deal with the health crisis and ignore the other vulnerabilities of women in the same breath. So according to me, this was where we faltered. Fine, we faltered. But what is the preparedness next time there's a crisis around? What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this situation? What kind of policy measures we are required to have? How can our laws and policies be so gender blind? It's not a new thing. That domestic violence against women is not a new thing. For the last 50 years, we have been talking about it. For the last 50 years, we have been campaigning for new laws. Earlier, there used to be like dowry demand, dowry death, etc. And in 2005, we got the Domestic Violence Act. Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. Protection of women from the Domestic Violence Act is a social legislation, benevolent legislation. So if in a crisis, it cannot be dumped away. It cannot be forsaken because we have another crisis at all. Your crisis intervention measures have to incorporate the measures within the Domestic Violence Act. There has to be an intersectionality within departments so that this kind of situation does not happen. The statistics say that some say it increased 10-fold, some say it increased 25-fold. It's just the numbers of the phone calls for 10. And there's no record what they did after the phone call. There's absolutely no record. So were these people equipped to receive those phone calls? Do you just have a helpline number and you do nothing about it? So if you see mental health, for instance, depression, despair among women was so high scale. So you could have online counseling, for instance, somebody talking to these women, a whole network of these to say, okay, like you can do this, you can do this, this will pass. We are with you, and we will bring out certain measures for you. What is your immediate need? I mean, do you need food? Do you need shelter? What do you need in this situation? So somebody has to be trained. Somebody has to be competent to answer that helpline. Today, the last pandemic, if you see the domestic the helpline, you had certain helplines, government, non-government, but they were doing nothing. They were doing nothing. They were not able to do anything. So it is again coming back to the constitution to make Article 14 effective. You have to always keep Article 15.3 in mind. Unless you keep Article 15.3 in mind, women cannot be equal to men at all. So we cannot say that the same policy will help everyone universally. It cannot be. You have to fine tune it to the needs of a vulnerable section so that they are empowered and they come to the scale where equality, Article 14, will have effect. So this is what I want to convey to you, and I'll answer questions after this. But this is the basic framework into which I want to explain what happened during the pandemic. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sunil. These were really enlightening words. And with your due permission, we would like to move on to question answer session. And the first session is sent to us by Aliza Tariq. She's asking, discriminatory criminal codes and criminal procedures definitely exist. For example, criminalizing forms of behavior that are not criminalized or punished harshly if they are performed by men, example, adultery. Is it possible to frame laws in such a way that can diminish this existing discrimination that not only arises due to societal norms but also because of the legal system itself?
Can you repeat such a long question?
Sure, ma'am. She's asking that discriminatory criminal
Can
codes
you
and
simplify it for me? Because I'm not
Sure.
able to grasp the whole question. What is the question actually?
Ma'am, she's asking, she's mentioning about adultery, and then she's asking, is it possible to frame laws in a way that are not discriminatory in nature, as the existing discrimination that not only arises due to societal norms, but also because of the legal system itself?
Yes, I agree with you that in addition, the judge's own bias that works. That I'm not particularly talking about adultery laws, because they'll say men and women both are adulterers, not just men are adulterers. When you say domestic violence, I'm speaking specifically for men. But even in the cases of domestic violence, dowry death, all these are very specifically violence against women issues. I would consider adultery where, in a way, both men and women can commit adultery. So I'm not talking on that. And adultery is not any longer a criminal offense at all. It's not punishable. It is a matrimonial offense. It is a civil fault entitling the partner in marriage for a divorce. So adultery is a ground for divorce. Nobody can punish anybody for adultery. We had something like 497 earlier. Now it is struck down, where a husband could sue another man for being adulterous with his wife. Now I can't go deeper into it because that's the topic of a totally another session, where it was an archaic law, etc. And they said this is not gender equal, women are not punished, only why other man is punished, etc. But according to me, this law is based on the notion of proprietorship. The woman is the property of the husband, and the man who commits adultery on his wife, in a way, steals that property or violates that property. So he has to be punished. So it was a very archaic concept of ownership of women. So there cannot be an equality in this. That means you punish men, you punish women, you punish the wife and the adulterer, or the wife can sue the husband's lover in the same way the husband can sue the wife's lover. I mean, if whichever way you see it, the notion of proprietorship dominates. So finally, it was struck down, I think, 2 years ago for 90. So whoever asked the question, you firstly to clarify that adultery is not a criminal offense anymore at all. Bigamy is, but not adultery. Adultery is a ground for divorce. But you ask a woman whose husband is adulterous, she would say, if I take a divorce, that will clear the path for him to marry that woman. Why should I take divorce? So women do not see divorce as an answer, as a ground for divorce, so that set the husband free at all. And today's marriages, so much adultery is there. It's unbelievable. Both men and women are adulterous. So I don't want to go in that, but I would stay within the realm of violence against women, which is one side. It's not both ways. We can say men and women both are violent towards each other. And of course, there is a bias in the courts. There is a very high level of bias. Apart from policy level biases, apart from normative biases, there is an additional courtroom bias. And we have to strive very hard to reduce that courtroom bias against women. Though you may have the best of laws, etc., but when you go to court and how the judges talk about women, how the judges address women, there itself you will see a very clear bias. Any other question?
Thank you for that. Navya is asking how gender specific laws are more prone to misuse because of the unequal burden placed on the accused. To repeat, how gender specific laws are more prone to misuse because of the unequal burden placed on the accused.
Where are you getting that? Where are you getting that? When you say every third woman in the country is a battered woman, where do you find the law being misused? According to me, that itself is biased. While we're talking about how many women are abused, how many women commit suicide, how many women are murdered, how many women are subjected to sexual violence, how can you come out with saying women are misusing the law? Women are not using the law enough. And then you come out with this cliched thing that women are misusing the law. What do you mean by misusing the law? For instance, like in Domestic Violence Act, let's say. Domestic Violence Act is a civil statute placed in a criminal court. It provides protection, injunction that a husband cannot throw the woman out. He has to provide maintenance to the wife and children. He cannot endanger a life. He cannot be abusive or threaten to throw her out, etc. And can get an injunction on that. A custody of children and compensation for the injuries suffered by her. So where you find the misuse here? If the husband has not done it, the wife goes and says, he's doing this. The court will only say, give in writing that you're not doing it. That's it. Where is the harm caused? Suppose he doesn't do anything and just for fancy she'll go on and fight, which I think really no woman will do, because going to court itself is there is so much barrier for women to approach the court, approach a lawyer. It's just not like you're attending some fashion parade or something else like that, or going to a mandir. It's not like going to court is not like that. Going to court is a very decisive action, and you have to go through several steps before you reach the court. So whoever tells you that women are misusing the law, according to me, there's an inherent bias there against women. You know, everybody who has a domestic maid, you ask her, and every domestic maid is subject to domestic violence. You ask them, how many of you go to court? There's a law, go to court. And they'll be shocked that none of them would have gone to court. So it is underuse of law rather than misuse of law. And the, what did you say, increased culpability of the husband of the accused person? Something she said. Is it because of that? In that question, there's
Because
one
of
more
the
part.
because of the unequal burden placed on the accused.
Unequal burden placed on the accused. In what way? Where is the unequal burden placed? Like it's like let's say uh, wife murder, dowry death it's called in the criminal law. What all things have to be there? That it has to be within 7 years of marriage. Just before her death, he must have made a dowry demand. And then she should have died under unnatural circumstances. Only when, and this is, she's not there anyway. Misuse or use, she is dead and gone. And then it is either her parents or the police or whatever filing criminal case. How do you think this is misuse? The woman is dead and gone anyway. I don't know if any of you have lost any family member this way. And if you have lost, it's so horrible, it's so traumatic. 1 year of marriage, 2 years of marriage, 3 years of marriage. The woman is highly depressed. She has a young child, maybe she's pregnant, and then she commits. She's either murdered or she is driven to suicide. We call these, and this is the criminal statute that I'm talking about. So when we say misuse, what do we mean? And there's another law 498. We think that is misuse. You look at the conviction, there's no conviction rates at all. Because nothing moves in the court. Nothing means nothing moves in the court. There is 498 conviction only when a woman has died. And it should go under much more severe offense. Comes down to 498. And there the punishment, maximum punishment is 3 years. And where even when there is conviction, courts give 6 months, 3 months. That's all. You call this misuse of the law. Of course, there's a big lobby going on. There's a lot of it is written. There's a men's rights lobbies and groups. Some judges pass such adverse comments. You will find judgment. There's one judge, there's a bench of the Supreme Court which said that before you file a case under 498A, you have to send the couple for counseling, etc., etc. Then the larger bench turned it down. They said, we are not parliament to make laws. We have to implement the law that is as it is. And this kind of adverse comment should not be made. So we cannot, as gender sensitive group of students or young people, cannot ask this, begin to ask like, oh, start with the premise women are misusing the law. And then we go further, why they are misusing the law. You're not saying these women misusing the law. And in these cases, the burden of proof shifts only, as I said, in all the other ingredients approved, only after that, when this woman in her own home, there's no witnesses, there's nobody, there's only a dead body that is there. So that is where the burden of proof shifts, not before that. So I urge you not to go by the societal biases.
Thank you for the answer, ma'am. We have Karishma Kandaran. She is a member of IDG and she would like to ask a question herself.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is, how can we make people informed about the fact that domestic violence isn't just physical violence? It also includes emotional and financial abuses as well, that even the victim and the perpetrator don't realize.
I agree with you, absolutely. Domestic Violence Act, the Protection of Women Against Domestic Violence Act of 2005, has broadened our notion of domestic violence. Earlier, it used to be like physical and the most emotional. And you had to show actually marks on your body, a broken bone, or stitches, etc. Only then courts would think there is domestic violence. Now, with this act, it is broadened to like sexual violence. We say there's no marital rape, there's no provision stopping husbands from raping their wives, etc. But sexual violence is mentioned in the Domestic Violence Act. So there is sexual violence, there's economic violence, not paying maintenance, not allowing you to go to work, taking away a salary. All that would come under the financial abuse provision, demanding dowry, all would come under economic abuse. Then we have emotional abuse, using abusive language, abusing her, abusing her parents, all of that will come here. And then there's physical violence. And also there is taking away the children from your custody, throwing her out of the matrimonial home. All this would come under domestic violence, any kind of abuse. You are absolutely right. Our courts, our lawyers, and our people in general still believe, after 15 years of the Domestic Violence Act being in existence, that there has to be physical violence. And without it, you can't file under the Domestic Violence Act. And if you do, you're misusing the law. Whereas the law itself is broadened like 15 years ago, not yesterday or today. So there is great need for creating awareness.
Thank you, ma'am. Ben is asking, how have your past cases affected the way you look at the situation of domestic violence incidents in the COVID-19 pandemic?
Can you again repeat it?
Sure, ma'am. How have your past cases affected the way you look at the situation of domestic violence incidents in the COVID-19 pandemic?
See, our past experience always like how we are dealing with the present situation. I've been for the 30 years. So my understanding, my analysis, all that is based on my experience before. But the pandemic raised a situation which we had not experienced or envisaged before. So that past experiences were under normal situations. Domestic Violence Act was there, protection officers were there, police stations were there, courts were working. You do all that, and even then there was a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulties. But you could make the law work if you worked very, very sincerely and in a very committed manner. You could give relief to the women. So whether I've worked before or I've not worked before, some lawyer has just started working 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago. This is a new situation that has been created, which nobody knew before. The judges, they were not aware. The police were not aware. The government was not aware. Our prime minister was not aware. Nobody was aware what is the best response to this pandemic. So the way I have dealt with cases earlier has nothing to do with the way the cases have to be dealt with during the pandemic. Because firstly, the husband abuser is in the home lockdown and he's not going out, and the only target he has to vent out his violence and anger and frustration is his wife. A situation like that is not there. Secondly, she's much more vulnerable because she's with him. He's not going out. She's with him, and there's no support services available. So this is a unique situation. And whether I have past experience or not, it doesn't matter. The experience of this present situation is unique in its own way. And of course, you compare it with the past situation. But there's nothing to compare here. Now we have to move forward. And we have to think, next time there's a pandemic, what can we do?
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Rajna will be asking a question to you.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, my question was the machinery under the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act had not been identified as an essential service during the lockdown. Hence, the protection officers were not able to visit households of victims, and NGOs were not able to help, like, have physical interactions with them. And even the police officers, being at the front line in our effort to tackle COVID-19, were kind of overwhelmed by everything that was happening. And so the victims didn't get the attention that they needed. Like, how do you think we can prevent this from happening in order to help them as much as possible in the future?
You know, the first thing the government has to do was to have, like, before you have a law, policy, etc., you have to have many more ministries involved in it, like women and child, home, health, finance, all of them. And their inputs are very important. You cannot one fine day say lockdown everything, and 4 hours later lockdown will come, and we'll see later what happens to people. It's not only health suffered, domestic violence increase, Even education suffered very, very drastically. Everything suffered actually. Economics, labor, everything suffered. So of course, it was coming. It had come to China. It had come to travel to Europe, and it was just a matter of days that we would be affected. But we were not bothered. The 2 months before it hit us, we did everything. Um, we had US president visiting us, and something else, and some pomp, and something, and people are shouting hoarse, see it's coming, see it's coming, and we have to be prepared, we have to be prepared. We were not prepared. So you cannot be, and many other countries were prepared, like for instance, New Zealand, Finland, Germany, small countries, big countries, etc., particularly where women were at the helm of things, handle the situation much, much better than us. So it was possible to handle. Like you have a far-sightedness. There is a pandemic happening. It will come to us sooner or later. And if it comes, this will be our way of tackling with it. They didn't do that. They wasted this 2 months' time doing totally useless things. And then suddenly when it hit us, they said, okay, lockdown. A sort of a knee-jerk response. But in the future, when you have to do like this, I think there has to be a working white paper, that is inter-ministerial paper, that what's the response of, what is the need of each of these issues governed by different ministries, and how each of them will collaborate. There's something like group of ministers. So in their group of ministers, this has to be put, and the action plan has to be put in place much before the action actually is enforced. You have to plan for it. We did not do this. Unfortunately, we did not do this. And okay, first wave happened, and then we relaxed, and we didn't prepare for the second wave to happen, and then the disaster that happened. Particularly in cities like Delhi, how many people died because of lack of oxygen? There was not oxygen as a primary emergency service was not available. How many people died? There were no burial grounds. They were just throwing the bodies. I mean, how gross is that? So now that we have the experience, I'm not at the helm of things like that to understand, but all the secretaries under each department, if they can come together and if they can talk out a program, invite experts to say like, okay, what went wrong in this sector, in this sector, in this sector, and then evolve a plan which you put in place. You keep it ready that next time it happens, this is how we are going to move ahead. Never mind which government is in power, it doesn't matter.
Thank you, ma'am. Nadia is asking, what are the steps that need to be taken for better cognizance of women facing domestic violence so that authorities can take appropriate actions?
First part I didn't hear. What are the
steps that need to be taken for better cognizance of women facing domestic violence so that authorities can take appropriate actions?
Actually, all that is all put down. There are a lot of papers written on Domestic Violence Act and how best to implement it. UN is also involved. UN Women is involved, and there are handbooks there how to use the law. There are mechanisms there put in place. There are trainings going on for the judiciary, for the police, for health workers, for protection officers. They've been doing all this, but I don't know what happens. I know in West Bengal for sure it's going on. In Maharashtra it's going on. In Delhi it's going on. I've been part of many of these training programs. Our organization does a lot of police training. We have done trainings with, I think, more than 20,000 police officers. We've done sustained training with the protection officers in Maharashtra. We have visited each district of Maharashtra and conducted training for magistrates. And in each training, there were like 20, 30, 50, 60 magistrates attending. And we have provided them with the case law saying that, this is what the higher courts are saying, this is what you need to know. So a lot of work is done. I'm not saying it's not done. In fact, so much work is done on the Domestic Violence Act as than any other act, actually. because it created a new norm. It created a new procedure. And the government was aware about it. And so they did a lot of things.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now Rangeen will be asking a question to you.
Who's that?
Rangeen Haldar.
Okay.
Rangeen, you can ask your question.
Thank you, Aditi. The question I have is that what can a policymaker do to prevent and address violence against women during COVID-19?
Again, can you repeat, please?
The question I have is that what can a policymaker do to prevent and address violence against women during COVID-19?
Yeah, that's exactly what I spoke. What I spoke all this time is exactly the policy level issues, which are not taken care of this time. But in future, whether it is COVID-19 or any other pandemic or any other crisis situation, these are the things you need to keep in place. Like for instance, declaring protection officers as primary healthcare or emergency care workers, training healthcare workers about violence against women, having accessibility to police stations and shelter homes, providing these as emergency services. So all this can be done, and if you can like have this, as I said, your white paper on all this to discuss each of these issues and the steps in which it has to be followed up step by step. Okay, if I say that healthcare workers have to be trained, then how many workers, at what level we are going to train, in what way are we going to train, what are we going to understand, that they have to be given clear guidelines that when you find a woman who is a victim of domestic violence, this is what you need to do. And give them this like maybe a manual or something that you follow this manual. And that has to be done through training. And every state has to do this. So what I've told you, these are the policy level issues which were ignored, but we cannot afford to ignore them.
Thank you, ma'am. How many more questions would you like to take?
You tell me. I mean, I don't know what's the time.
It's 7 o'clock.
You tell me how much more.
Sure, ma'am. So I'll take a couple of questions more. So the next question is sent to us by Abhin. A substantial portion of women who reside in a rural area are non-cognizant about their rights and the prevailing domestic laws for their protection. How can we protect such women from the perils of domestic violence during the pandemic? How can we sensitize them to enforce their rights?
See, we're talking about rural areas, but even in the urban area, they're not aware. So rural is a far off thing. And where urban India was affected during the pandemic, it's not the same as the rural India. In fact, rural India came much later, and the rural population is not like clubbed together as the urban population, like the Dharavi slums and many other slums in Bombay, for instance. So such great danger of its spreading, community circulation and spread of the disease. So you have to do everything to protect. So I just want to tell you, forget the rural people. Are urban people aware? Or urban poor are aware? Or urban middle class is aware? Or urban educated people are aware? Nobody is aware about their rights. And even educated people in urban areas, professionals, etc., are not aware of the Domestic Violence Act and what measures they need to take to protect themselves. It's only when in like utter despair that they approach a lawyer. And by the time they have lost everything, and then they come and ask for legal advice. According to me, this legal education has to start from the high school level in a very, very practical sense. Not just what the constitution says and etc., etc., but in a practical sense, these are my rights. And this is my dignity. And I need to protect it, even in marriage. So this understanding is not there today. In fact, even among the educated. So of course we have to protect the poor and the rural India and rural women who are victims. But according to me, it is far, far more prevalent in urban India and even among the middle class. So we must start with educating them. In fact, I've noticed that some of our judges who come from rural areas are extremely sensitive to women's questions, far more than the ones from the urban area.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Aliza is asking, how can we make access to justice easier considering the taboo that follows and the notion of normalcy that prevails?
Again, sir?
How can we make access to justice easier considering the taboo that follows and the notion of normalcy that prevails?
Yeah, for us, the most difficult and challenging part is the access to justice. In fact, we have all the laws. We have very good laws, but we don't have access to justice. Access to justice is expensive, very expensive. State legal aid does not work, and people have no faith in state legal aid. So, what our organization does primarily is to provide access to justice. That you have trained lawyers who are able to provide this access to justice to people. So this is very much needed, and such NGOs are there in every city almost, who provide this access to women to go to court, to access justice, whether it's sexual abuse or domestic.
Thank you, ma'am. Toshita is asking, ma'am, you drew comparisons with New Zealand for COVID pandemic management. To what extent do you think this is correct considering complexities of a country like a diverse population density, illiteracy, etc.?
Let's not take New Zealand or Finland. Let's take Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. Like you saw the report on hunger and poverty, where India slide down, I think, 6 or 7 rungs, and we're like 101 out of 116 countries. You see Bangladesh, you see Nepal, you see Sri Lanka, you see Pakistan. Each of them are faring better than us. So that, and then the government has rubbished the report saying that they have not used the proper parameters, etc., etc. Other countries are satisfied with the way methodology, and we are not satisfied with the methodology because it reflects us in bad light. It cannot be. No, we have to be self-reflective and say, why are we sliding down? What are the poverty levels? What happened during pandemic? Why these people were hungry and starving and died of starvation? This is something a real concern. Population are there, numbers are there, but every state is supposed to govern its own affairs regarding health, sanitation, food accessibility, etc. You know, we're a vast country, but we are a federal structure. Every state has its own mechanisms, budgets, everything. So take it state by state. Delhi was doing Delhi administration is doing better regarding health and education actually. So you have to see that which state is governing well. So within the state, if we see the population, not so much. It's divided, isn't it? So you can't take country as a whole and say, oh, we have numbers and that's why we can't deal with it. That is no excuse. We have poverty, yes. We have illiteracy, yes. But we have also the greatest wealth in a country. I think in that Forbes list, I think there are at least 6 or 7 Indians there in the top notch. So it's not that we don't have money in our country. There are not rich people, but they don't do philanthropy like other rich people in other countries do. In our country, the rich are getting richer and richer. Even during the pandemic, they got richer. And the poorer are getting poorer and poorer. So this is our sad situation. It's not that we are poor as a country as a whole. No, there is inequality. There is a lot of disparity between classes of people.
Thank you, ma'am. Isana is asking, while Article 15.3 can be a basis for securing Article 14 right of women, how can it be deployed in a way which does not perpetuate gender stereotypes? The state often uses protectionist laws in the name of Article 15.3, which shifts the onus of them for securing safe environments and instead places the burden on women.
It is true. It is Article 15.3 is seen more as a protectionist law, and is not seen in the context of setting right and historical wrong. So we need to have a different framework away from that protectionist attitude. And to say that, like for instance, 125 CRPC or Domestic Violence Act, now these are measures to set right the historical wrong. They're not, the government is not doling or something for the women and then we need to protect them. No, this is a question of right. This is a question of right and justice, and that is the framework we need to adopt. And not just like we have curfew for girls hostels after 8, they cannot come out because if they come out, they'll be raped. So we'll lock them inside. That is a protectionist attitude. Whereas we make the city safe for all women, all men, everybody. That is a way to lead to equality. And I agree with you that only when we have these kind of empowering measures and the women get empowered, then the Article 14 will come to life, where we say we are all equal and we need equal protection from the law.
Thank you, ma'am. Tanish would like to ask a question to you now.
Ma'am, am I audible?
Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. I just wanted to know something about your organization, Majlis, and if there were any problems that you might have faced during its inception, and what was the idea behind it and stuff.
Can you just repeat again?
Yes,
what was about the organization?
I just wanted to know the main idea behind this organization and whether you might have faced any problems during its inception.
We've faced a lot of problems. We have been in existence from 1991. For the 30 years, we have survived on grants and donations. We function as an all-women team of lawyers and support persons. And the basic idea is that two things is to empower women lawyers into litigation realm, not only in Bombay but also in the district towns of Maharashtra, etc. And also women, particularly women and children who are sexually violated, etc., feel much more comfortable when they talk to a woman lawyer. So that is the idea behind having this all-women team. And the challenges we have is every step we have problems, and somehow we have been able to survive up to now doing this work. Getting grants and donations is a major problem. This work creates high burnout day in and day out, dealing with situations of women who are themselves like in depression, etc., after facing violence. Then the problems created by pandemic, which made everything worse. When the courts are not there, there's nothing functioning, etc. So there are a lot of challenges. The idea behind it that is that if you have a dedicated organization, a team of lawyers who are able to represent women, usually women have suspicion that their lawyers may collude with the other side. And they're all the time scared. They're scared to go to court, they're scared to trust their lawyer, etc. The idea was that at least their lawyer will not compromise with the other side. We cannot assure that they will get all their rights, whatever they ask. They may not. But we will do our best. We'll give them our best services and at least they will be assured that their lawyer will do the right thing in the court, will not prolong litigation just because a long time litigation is lucrative for the lawyers. They'll try to settle the matter at the earliest. There'll be fees charged, but the fees will be reasonable and within how much the woman can afford. So these were all the principles that we set for ourselves. I do not know how we will proceed in the future, but this is how we are at the moment. Apart from litigation, we do a lot of trainings, campaigns, public interest litigation, all that to make this space for women better and safer.
Thank you, ma'am. We have Nakul with us. He would like to ask a question to you.
Ma'am, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Ma'am, ma'am, my question is on section 498A. So I was going through a few High Court decisions, ma'am. So, ma'am, it's noticed that, ma'am, the victim, when she is no more, ma'am, in such cases, all the statements that she's spoken to her own blood relatives or the statement that she's spoken to at her parental house, so most of the times they are often held inadmissible in the court of law on the grounds of being hearsay, and there is visible hesitation in the court to also bring it under the ambit of section 32 evidence. So I'm like, my question is that what is the way out of this? Because obviously you cannot expect the deceased during her lifetime to speak all of this, to speak all of these statements to her in-laws. That's not happening. So what is the way out of this, if there is any?
You know, actually, this is a topic of discussion. They can have a whole session on this. There's a lot of contradictions here, particularly this dying declarations, etc. Like when a woman is married and faces violence, her aim is not to break the marriage. Her aim is to end the violence somehow. Now, finally, she wants to stay in the marriage because she's not welcome in her natal family. She has children. She doesn't want to leave the children. She can't take the children. So till the very, very end, she wants to save her marriage. And she doesn't want to implicate her in-laws and husband, contrary to the misuse theory. Then, last she knows she's dying, and she gives a statement saying, "This is my husband did this." Now, when a court examines all this together, there is so much of back and forth here, ups and downs here, and the law expects a linear narrative. The law expects that you will be very clear, you will say very clearly, this happened to me, and hence the matter will be proved in court. Now, when you have violence from strangers, like a murder case, that is in the public, there is a background building up, there is animosity between two factions, and then the violence plays up and there is death, murder. Here it is not so. Here it is in the family. The man is the father of your children. You don't want him to go to jail and be there in 7 years. Not at all. You want to have a harmonious relationship here. And you will do your best. Even your family wants that. The family also doesn't want you to break the marriage. Every time she goes back, for the dowry demand, she comes back with whatever they ask for. But then comes a stage where the parents say, or the brother says, no more. This is the end. When she goes there, that's when actually she dies. She may commit suicide because she cannot live with this at all, with this humiliation, with the violence, and no support in the parental home. I will tell you that no woman will ever commit suicide if she has the parental support. If her parents are able to tell her that this is your home, if there's violence there, you come back. You're our daughter. There'll always be a place for you. You want to bring your children, and you can start work. You're educated, and you make a new life for yourself. Parents don't say that. Parents say you go back, you adjust, you do this, you do that. Okay, if they want a chain, demanding a chain, we give the chain. They want a motorcycle, we'll give a motorcycle. Until the very end, this process goes on. I've run a whole article which is published in a journal that came out. What exactly happens in such cases? how there's a total shift that there's one kind of narrative to save the marriage, to undermine the violence. And when the moment of death, you say, no, this whole life, whatever I said is not true, but what I'm saying today now is true. And the court's finding it very difficult, as per the norms of the criminal procedure, to go by her last words. When you say death, dying declaration, there has to be only one dying declaration. She has to say one thing. Here you have three dying declarations. She said one thing before, then she says one midway, and there's another dying declaration at the end. So how the criminal law envisages a criminal trial is not in that framework. Women's narratives do not fit, unfortunately, and that is why acquittals happen. Not that there is no violence. It's just you are not able to prove this violence in the court of law. And when she is dying, even then she has this fear that if I'm dead and my husband is locked up, what is going to happen to my children? There's a saying, dying declarations are based on this premise that truth sits upon the lips of dying men. But truth does not sit on the lips of dying women at all. Till the very end, they like to make the best of the situation, try to cope with the situation, and all the time thinking about their children. I've analyzed a lot of judgments on this.
Thank you, ma'am.
I can share the article if I find the link.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this insightful session and a question and answer session especially. I personally thank you for agreeing to have
Because
a
you all
session.
went far and wide. What was your topic was what happened during the pandemic and policy, etc. And then you all traveled so far and wide from that point.
Ma'am, because I think none of us want to miss the opportunity to ask such questions to a legal luminary of your stature. On this note, I would request Navya to give a formal vote of thanks.
A very good evening, ma'am. On behalf of the informal discussion group NUJS, I, Navya, would like to express my sincere gratitude to you. We are extremely honored that you graced us with your presence today. It is truly a privilege for us to interact with you, and I'm sure every one of us is taking away something valuable from this immensely insightful session. I would like to thank you for enlightening everyone present here on domestic violence in COVID-19 pandemic and the critical analysis of the gender-blind legal system. I would also like to thank the members of the IDG committee who contributed to the very successful conduction of this session. I would also like to thank the members of the faculty and all the attendees for their graceful presence and participation. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed answering your questions.